Mary, Emily, hello, how are you doing?
Good. So nice
Very
to
well.
see you this morning.
Nice to see you too. We're starting films by asking people to introduce themselves and give us a sense of their work. So perhaps if we start with Mary, please.
Sure. My name is Mary Candler. I'm the artistic director of Hedgepig Ensemble Theater and one of the team leaders on Expand the Canon. I'm here in Brooklyn, New York, and we make plays.
Thank you. Emily.
I'm Emily Lyon. I'm the Associate Artistic Director of Hedgepig Ensemble, and I was also one of the curators of Expand the Canon. I'm also a director and dramaturg, freelance also in Brooklyn. And I love working with Mary, and we've done that a lot.
Great. Thank you for welcoming me into that world for this film. If we can start with expand the canon, then, and I'm just thinking about that three-word phrase as a phrase. For lots of people, some of those words will be new, and I've just been rewatching Star Wars. So in my head, a canon is something. If you're going to expand a canon, that's because you're at war with someone and you're looking for the largest machinery you can come up with. What does that phrase mean in this particular instance?
That's a great question, Andy. And for us, when we're looking at canon, we're not thinking boom, cannon fire. We're thinking about the traditional canonical works that we revere as great classics. So it is a set of plays that kind of culturally we have accepted as plays to be revered and respected and done and read and taught.
And so when we come to expanding it, does that mean we accept that canon and we add to it, or are we challenging that canon as well? What sort of relationship does this work have with the canonical?
That is a great question. We really have been focusing on expansion and adding new voices, really trying not to think about this as minimizing any voices that have been there. Although, to be fair, I think there are some works in the traditional canon that still get a lot of love that perhaps we do want to reevaluate. That is, however, not the function of this project.
Great, thank you. So would you mind telling us a bit about how you are expanding the canon? What kinds of work or writers or creators do you have your eye on?
Emily, do you want to jump on that?
Yeah, I mean, Hedgepig's mission is to amplify the voices of women in classics. And so this is another avenue of doing that. We are looking at women playwrights, women and non-gender conforming playwrights, although there are fewer conversations around that before these times, and we're glad that they're happening now. But we were taking a particular look at women playwrights through history that deserve a legacy. And so those are the plays that we're adding to the canon and we feel deserve to be heard, produced, and appreciated.
Great, thank you. As a bit lit host, I feel like it's my job at this point to point viewers if they would like to watch something after watching this film. We already have some really exciting content, I think, on non-gender conforming writers through history, including in Shakespeare's time, the 18th century. And it's exciting to hear that you guys are thinking about this issue. Are we thinking about particular time periods here, particular geographical places, or is everything wide open for you?
The time period is something we really wrestled with, certainly, because we've really talking about classics. And I gotta tell you, like that, everyone has an opinion about what the time period of a classic is. And we kind of, in a weird way, didn't have an opinion on that. We thought it just had to be timeless in a certain sense of like could speak across history. Um, but we didn't have like a date in mind. And so we really started off thinking like, okay, we're going to look at plays before 1945. We're going to look at public domain works. And that was the beginning of our work, really digging into those plays. The 2020 list, our inaugural Expand the Canon list, which we should also probably say, like, what is that? But teaser, we'll get to that in a second. It spans 17th century through 20th century. So we're really looking for a wide cross section of time and geography and all of these things. We spent a lot of time talking about what the most contemporary classics could be reasonably. And that was very much in conversation about wanting to make this a very diverse list. We want not just to say, hey, let's expand from dead white men in the canon to dead white women. That doesn't seem like a particularly helpful step forward, but wanting to make sure that we are expanding to a wide and diverse group of voices represented in the canon. And that meant that we did have to really look at more modern plays. And
we talked a lot about like specifically different classics, right? Like arguably, not even arguably, factually, I think, August Wilson is a Black classic. And he was writing in the 80s, 90s, and even up to the 2000s. So if we're really committed to having a plurality of voices on this list, we're like, well, all right, what is a classic? What deserves to be canon? And it's plays that are in conversation with what we think is currently classics or canon now. So, you know, I think if they're worthy plays by women or non-gender conforming folks that are no longer alive to advocate for themselves, if they are timeless and excellent and deserve to have a louder voice in the room, then they're worth including.
Thank you. I want to make sure we stick with all those ideas, and I'm not trying to move us on, but I'm wondering about this idea, and I think I'm quoting one of you here, of thinking about whose voices are represented in the canon, and then your own work, which is re-representing and redistributing the kinds of voices that get represented. So I wonder, we've talked a bit about dead people who might be classics, but what about the live people that you guys work with and represent in your work by casting them, by working with them? And what about the audiences? So, you know, how do you market work which one of the reason you're excited in it is that it's been lost and therefore doesn't have a reputation which gives you give you an audience? Yeah, do you mind telling us a little bit about those? I know that there's a huge questions and there's several questions meshed in there, but there's something there about the writers we represent, the kinds of performers, and reaching an audience. And I wonder if they tie together.
Yeah, I think something that's exciting about representing more diverse voices on stages is, you know, I think we've, in the theater industry, been doing a lot of kind of like, oh, well, we want to diversify casting. We want to have more types of people in these plays. And then we're like shoving people into plays that, you know, we're like, oh, we could, you know, first we were color blind, right? And then we were color conscious. And now we're hopefully telling more diverse stories. So it's like very clear who needs to be telling stories and really opening up who is on stages. So I think it's also part of the evolution of where like the theater industry's been trying to do right, but didn't have the tools. And the tools are that we just need to be telling other stories as well. And this is true of even how we got into this project, because, you know, we're a feminist classical company. And for 8 years, we've been doing a lot of work trying to figure out what kind of pretzel format we needed to put ourselves into to make this a feminist production, even though it kind of wasn't, you know, or didn't want to be. And the answer is just like, maybe change the story you're telling. And suddenly things fall into place. And like you mentioned, you know, there are all these women writers writing about gender issues and issues that we find much more compelling and to talk about, versus being like, well, how do we do all's well that ends well from a feminist perspective? And we have, but it was pretzel inducing, right?
Yeah. And I mean, even the plays that are about interesting women. We did a production of Mary Stuart, which was really lovely. And you've got these two fascinating female characters, and yet you can still tell that it's written from a perspective of a man, you know, like just the way that they speak, the way that they interact. It's just fascinating that way. And yes, absolutely. There's one play, maybe we're jumping ahead a bit, spoilers, on our list that is what I think should replace or be in conversation with Taming of the Shrew. I've worked with many productions of Taming of the Shrew, and there's always that like truly pretzel moment of, well, how do we make the ending work so that, you know, and why? There was part of your question that had to do with marketing. And I think part of the conversation can be like, come see what should be the new Taming of the Shrew. Now, you're going to get very niche audiences for that, for sure. But some of the names on our list actually do have a cachet. It's not that they're necessarily like completely unmarketable. Mae West is on our list. Zora Neale Hurston is on our list. These names that carry weight. We just aren't conscious of them in a classic canon, and aren't necessarily always thinking about them as playwrights. So I would say there's still quite a bit of cachet of sexy marketableness that comes with these women too. Even if, because also Mae West, 4 hours of Hamlet. Of course, I'm working on a Hamlet, so that's not a good example, but yeah, I think there's still a lot to be excited about in these women and in these casts. I think also having more diverse voices means that we get to have more diverse audiences and more diverse people coming in to enjoy theater and have these conversations, and the conversations that these women wanted to open up for us.
Yeah, your work is completely fascinating because it's raising so many questions about who theatre is for, or can be for, or should be for. And I wonder how the work you're doing in New York City would look. And I may be showing my ignorance here, and maybe you too as well, but I also wonder, some of the audiences we're speaking about may not feel safe congregating in a space like a theatre. I mean, certainly I've had experience working on shows which are about and feature non-gender conforming performers, where audiences simply may not feel safe traveling to such shows. And the same can be true when seeking to represent disabled experience and disabled audiences. Questions of who gets to be in these spaces and what obstacles do we need to overcome as producers of work. I don't know, have you guys experienced anything like that in relation to building an audience?
I'm sure that we do experience that, and that we as producers can continue to find ways to invite audiences in. I would say that in an odd way, this pause that theaters are experiencing due to the pandemic, that this project of Expand the Canon is hopefully aligning with some deeper work of reevaluating kind of how they are systematically, and I put ourselves in that category as well, how we are kind of looking at the systematic assumptions that we're making and who we are including. And even if we think we're including other people or asking other people to join us, are we really creating the space for that? So I don't think that just expanding the canon and saying like we put a play up by a Latinx writer, then we like fully anticipate that these Latinx audience will come join us. I think much more work has to be done in tandem with that. But this is one tool in the toolkit to make that possible.
Great, thank you. There are a number of issues already coming out of things that you've said. We've talked a little bit about the kinds of people that we might represent as writers and as performers. But Emily in particular was pointing us towards the kinds of stories that you start to tell when you engage with plays which have been kept out of the canon. And you were talking to Emily about having a sense that some classical plays have a very male point of view. So I guess there's questions there of both stories and then the kind of narrative point of view from which the stories are being told. Would either of you mind telling us a bit more about that, about your experience of working with plays with no real history of being performed, and kind of narrative discoveries, or things which feel new from pursuing that kind of work?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that makes this a bit trickier is that we've released this list during the pandemic, and so we've been able to put together readings of these plays, but also they've been Zoom readings. So I won't necessarily claim to having a lot of narrative discoveries in this sort of fascinating new medium that we're using. But I think, rather than like performative discoveries, I think narratively, and this is perhaps less a discovery and more something I always kind of knew, and why I thought the project was something that would be exciting, is that it just, so for example, this Taming of the Shrew version that I think we should just copy and paste every time we're trying to do Shrew, do this play instead. It's called
Sorry,
Bold Stroke.
sorry, I was about to say, can tell us what it's called, and now you are. Sorry.
Yes. Perfect. No, we're on the same wavelength. It's called A Bold Stroke for a Husband by Hannah Cowley. And it has, instead of one strong female character, which often to me is sort of a telltale phrase of a character that has actual opinions. I don't know how many women you've met in your life that don't have opinions. So I would offer that those are just women characters, but a woman character with agency. So we have one woman character with agency and one woman character who is sort of manipulating the fact that she doesn't have any and is doing her best in sort of a very different format. In Bold Stroke, we have 5 women who have agency and opinions and points of view, and they're all advocating for something slightly different. And they're all unique. And that's one of the, it was just so thrilling to read it the first time, being like, yes, thank you, more than one, more than one. Oh my gosh, another one. Like that we can have these fully fleshed out female characters where we just don't have to do as much work to fill in. There will always still be those sort of smaller characters that have less stage time and you have to invent backstories for, but let's not have that necessarily be our main female leads.
Yeah, I also want to shout out another play on our list, which is Anima, or Her Soul by Emilia Roselli. And, as someone that primarily all of my training and all of my stage work was classical plays by men, I realized in reading this is the first play that I'd read that's kind of, I think it's late 1800s play, where it really grapples with sexual trauma and grapples with it from a woman's point of view and how that affects her life. And I realized that in the past, sexual trauma certainly happens in classical plays, but it's often a plot device to move things forward rather than a, exploration of a human and how that really affects us on a human level. So that's just a different way of using that in narrative. It is a different narrative because of, I think, only a woman can write about a woman's sexual trauma in a really meaningful way.
Yeah, thank you. Those are both really helpful examples and demonstrate again why it's so exciting what you're doing. I'm just going to continue unpacking a couple more things you said, if that's all right, before moving to a new question. The first thing I just want to take note of the fact is that you both used the pretzel as your go-to metaphor for your work. And
we're very hungry.
It's breakfast time for you guys, I know. I'm fascinated by that, partly because I'm from a culture which doesn't really do pretzels. So I've been trying to think what the right translation is, like a croissant-inducing moment. Is that similarly twisty? I presume that's, so I just want to revisit that to make sure I've understood that metaphor. But is that what you're saying, where going through certain kinds of contortions in order to bring the work into fruition? Is that what we're thinking?
Yeah, I would say like mental yoga sometimes is what I feel like we're doing. To be like, okay, well, I initially fell in love with Shakespeare with Midsummer Night's Dream when I was deeply in love with a boy, and he shockingly did not love me back. And I was like, oh, I am Helena. I understand. Yes, everything about this is me. Let's do this play, and I will reenact my sadness. But there's that spaniel speech, right? You come up to the spaniel speech, and it's always that she's the butt of the joke, and she's on her knees, pathetically asking, please kick me, please. And it was the first Shakespeare play that I directed. And I was really committed because I am not that pathetic. I was pathetic, but I was not that pathetic. I don't know any woman who's that. Maybe, I'm sure there are some, but as we all come in all flavors, right? But I didn't want to show a woman entirely giving over her agency. However, I then had to do like, well, how do I put this into a lens that works for feminism, that works for the story I'm telling, and works for the woman that I know, the character that embodies the rest of this story and makes sense of the rest of this story, while giving her respect and dignity, and of course, still comedy, but but being a human woman that I would recognize. And for me, I really leaned into, okay, being a spaniel would be better than how you're treating me. Fine, spurn me, kick me, whatever. I wish I had the last line like memorized. But essentially, like, do your worst. That would still be better than how you're treating me now, which is awful. You're running away. At least stay to engage. And that may or may not have been the intention of the text, but to make a human woman that I recognize out of the text that is there involves mental contortions. And yet I'm also very aware that we do that to make plays modern. We cut things, we change words for us to understand them now. So it doesn't feel like it's something that is an inappropriate or a choice that is vastly outside of some of the things that we need to do with these classic plays in general. But specifically as a female dramaturg and director, I'm often having to work with an actor to be like, okay, go with me. If we read this line this way, and then we kind of like do one of those into that logical jump. And it's just a breath of fresh air to be like, great, let's just do the play.
And that's what's happening as you expand the canon, that you're turning to plays which don't require this pretzelacious dramaturgical approach.
Pretzelacious, word of 2020. Thank you.
I feel like it particularly works in my accent, which is so unaccustomed to saying the word. And then this is sort of the $1 million question, I suppose, or maybe it's just a stupid one, but where do you find these plays, guys? What do you do to do you just wander around and look under things? How do
kinda I mean, kinda. We started out with this great idea that was like, I don't know if you're familiar with the Kilroy's list. It's a list of plays that is published every year by a group of women and non-conforming folks that brings to light some contemporary plays by women and says, like, these are great, do these plays, there's no excuse not to do these plays. And this was one of our inspirations very much, of like the Kilroy's list for the classics. And the Kilroy's is very crowdsourced. It is like, what have you seen, what have you read, suggest what titles should be on this list. And we were like, we will do that also. And we like put out a form, and then we said, please submit play ideas. Like, what should we be considering as classics, plays by women? And we got like some form submissions. And then we really ran into, really the problem that we were addressing, which is no one knows these plays. People know Afra Ben, people know Hannah Cowley a little bit. There are some names out there that, of course, people turned in, but we just suspected that there were way more plays out there that were worthy and worth digging for. So then it just became like detective work, right? I mean, looking at an anthology and finding the little footnote that said, also this play written by this person, and then going and figuring out where we could find that, and, going down internet rabbit holes. Google Books is an amazing research tool. And even if I can't read the whole book, if I can read those footnotes, like, we can find our way down things. But it was a lot of asking people like, hey, do you have this play? Can you scan this play and send it to us? Because the libraries were closed during COVID. A lot of university systems, luckily, have so much digitized now. But in year 2 and year 3 and year 4, when we can actually get to libraries and get to the texts that haven't been digitized yet, that's where I think we're really going to start finding some amazing gems. But I would love, Emily went down like some amazing rabbit holes and found some amazing plays. So I would love to hear also from you about kind of some of your journeys, especially towards Japanese classics.
Yeah. We were really committed to having this be a list that was inclusive and really did look at what can we expand. And I was very conscious of like, we don't have any Asian writers on this list. No one has submitted any of those. Who are the great Asian writers that we should be producing right now? There are, let me tell you just from now, that there are many, and most of them have not been translated into English. So that becomes a lot harder as a person that only reads English fluently and is working with an English audience. So starting to go down that rabbit hole, I was looking in a lot of different categories. I was looking for Indian plays. I was looking for Chinese plays. Like, we were looking for something. And I finally got like the thread of, as you said, Mary, like an anthology that had Japanese plays in it. And I think one was by a woman, and it just happened to have in its preface, here are some other plays that are by Japanese women. And I was like, okay. So I started typing them all into our like giant list. And started Googling, like, can I find that one? Is that one available? Is it in English? Anybody? And I got some leads and found a play by a Japanese writer in an anthology somewhere on the internet that was really amazing. And I had been in conversation actually I actually emailed the person that put together the anthology to be like, hi, here's what we're doing. Help. Wonderfully, if there's anything I can like pass on as just good advice for everything in the world, people answer cold emails way more than you think they will. So luckily he was like, yeah, hey, that sounds like great project. Do you know, here are some other people, maybe they have thoughts. Ended up finding this one play that feels like it is deeply in conversation, especially with theater at the moment, between an artist and a girl very interested in politics, and what is more of a pressing need at the moment, which was amazing. And so we're like, this is great, but it's a short play. Can we find another Japanese play to pair with this play, and like keep going down that rabbit hole? And because we wanted to make sure that all of these plays were accessible, and we just took all of the guesswork out. We wanted to know, all right, how can, if someone wants to produce this play, how can we make it like handed on a silver platter? Here's how you produce it, no guesswork. So I emailed the translator, again, cold emails, y'all, good stuff. And she was like, oh, yeah, sure. Here, and also, by the way, since you asked, I do actually have another short play by this same Japanese writer that I think would pair well. So on our list are two one-act plays by Fumiko Enchi, translated by Ayako Kano, and the second of the two, so the first is A Restless Night in Late Spring, which we fell in love with. The second of the two, A Hell of Her Own, is a new translation that she had just been working on a draft, and now it can be out there in the world. So definitely a lot of emailing, some digging, and many furious typing in Googles to get some of these plays, but it was all worth it. It was all worth it for sure.
Absolutely. And I guess it's easy to think of what you're doing as purely historical, but you're also describing there a kind of contemporary, very constructive and optimistic world building and community building, which would be easy to call networking. But you're bringing together the work of people, which itself can easily be marginalized, certainly within kind of Western theatre going and academic conversations. So there's a real liveness to the work that you're doing. It's not just about the dead people that you want to rescue, but the new conversations that you're producing is really incredibly exciting, I think. We're heading towards the end of the film, so I'd like to invite you both to think about whether there's anything more you'd like to tell our audience in relation to this project or Hedgepig. I will tell our audience that the place for them to head to is underneath our film and our further resources, but is hedgepigensemble.org, where there is a tab for Expand the Canon, where they can see some of the work that you've been doing. But yes, other questions I should have asked you and things that you would like to say before we wrap up?
Oh, the only thing I think I really want to say is that this is the beginning of this project. We just did our first inaugural year that culminated in a list of 8 timely, excellent, and producible plays by women from across time. but this is year one. We have hundreds of plays on our reading list, and we know we're missing so many. And so we really want to say, hey, please be part of this community building. Email us if there are plays that you think should be, shouted about and done on stages everywhere. We want to shout about them, and we want to read them and consider them. So we would love to keep building this community and include you, Andy, and your amazing audience in that community.
Yeah, I strongly encourage our audience to be in touch, and I apologize for the fact that I will totally be in touch.
Yes, I would just say, read these plays, go look at the list, embrace them, think of them as your own. And I think that in a lot of ways, that's what the canon is, right? Like Shakespeare are plays that we love, that we find ourselves in, that we keep going back to explore. So read these plays, love these plays, produce these plays, and yeah, send us more.
They're on our website. You can download the scripts, even some suggested cuts in case you don't want to do any of that guesswork. It's there. It's there for you. Go produce these plays for your students, for your communities. They're amazing.
Fantastic. What a wonderful resource. Thank you very much on behalf of theatre.
Wow, theatre thanked us today. That was cool. Thank you.
Guys, we're ending our films by asking a slightly random and esoteric question, but this project that we're speaking on now is called A Bit Lit, and is sort of interested in what it is that makes things literary and how we feel about that, hence the bit. We're quite interested in the bittiness of our project. So we ask our contributors what the word literature means to them, where it sits in their vocabulary. Is it a word that's useful to you in your work? And I guess it feels like your work is especially, it's putting political pressure, quite rightly, on what does and doesn't get to count as literature or as a classic. So yeah, would you mind telling us a little bit about that to wrap up?
Sure. I mean, I'll jump in. This is a terrifying question, I think. I don't use the word literature very much. It's not part of my normal vocabulary, but I suppose, I do use classics and the canon a lot, which is really parallel to that. And I think I don't use the word literature because it removes work from me somehow. It puts it on a shelf somewhere. And very much this project is trying to shake up the shelf, trying to fit more things on the shelf. So I think in a way, I'd like to tear down literature.
I think I use, so I'm a dramaturg, and I've also been a literary manager, which means mostly reading scripts and determining if we would ever want to do them, which is an interesting term, because I also, sort of akin to Mary, think literature can be sort of freezes something in time, as a term to me of okay, it's literature, it's been printed, it's now in a book, it is now official. And what we do as theater makers is we take it off the shelf and we make it live. We make it a conversation. So I think it, in a way, sort of ceases being literature and becomes literature.
Literature. Yes.
We'll workshop that. But I think, the more and more that we can put down the idea that literature is something frozen in time, that it's set, that there is a canon. Because one thing that Mary has said in the past is that how we define the classics says more about us than it does about the canon. And so I think while literature often to me means something that is already set, something frozen, something printed and done, it's not. It's still in conversation with us and what we do and what conversations we want to have and embrace.
Yeah, I like that very much. I don't know about live-riture, but liver-riture sounds like something you might go to your doctor with. I've got a really bad case of liver-riture.
Workshop, I can get back to you.
I think that's fantastic. The work you're doing is so exciting, guys, and I'm really looking forward to seeing where the project goes next. Thank you again on behalf of the theatre. I don't know why I'm thanking you on behalf of them. Certainly on behalf of me. Yeah, I think that what I'm taking away from your answer to the last question is that textiness is a problem, text bookishness, the kind of inert thing that happens. We can often think of things that are written down as becoming inert, but there's a paradox there as well, I guess, because I presume you guys couldn't do the work you're doing without texts. So the ability to rediscover the lost also needs that process of texting in a very uncontemporary sense of that word. But yeah, I'm really fascinated by where we've ended. Thank you both very, very much.
Thank you.